Is this ring a cursed relic of betrayal and incest and Anne Boleyn's very sad tale? So this ring is associated with the Boleyn family. And before we talk about the ring, let's talk a little bit about Anne. So Anne Boleyn was at the court of Henry VIII. Henry VIII was at the time married to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Queen Catherine of Aragon had been his wife. Before that, she had been the wife of Henry VIII's brother. And Catherine of Aragon was, one, devoutly Catholic, and two, only able to bear him one child, Princess Mary. So Henry VIII was looking around for somebody who might both bear him a son and also give him the kinds of pleasures he wasn't receiving with Catherine of Aragon. And Anne had been educated in France. She was the daughter of a nobleman, and she had been in France where she was learning politics, poetry, and was very effervescent. She, unlike Catherine of Aragon, was really good at having verbal conversations, sparring with Henry VIII. She wasn't sort of standing down to him. And of course, Henry VIII was used to people agreeing with him. After all, he was the king. And so he really turned his advances on Anne. Now, Anne refused to be just another mistress. And so basically, Henry wanted her and had to give her the crown. And that power play meant that, in essence, the marriage of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII was done. It does precipitate also the break in England of the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church. And they are happy for a little while. In 1533, Anne gives birth, and Henry is overjoyed. However, the child is not a son. Instead, it is Elizabeth I. She continues to try for children, but she has a number of miscarriages. And so Henry's love for Anne quickly turns to disappointment. And with that disappointment, it also turns to resentment. And he starts looking around his court for somebody who might make a more pleasant wife. And he does see a very sweet young woman named Jane Seymour. But Jane Seymour is the topic of another video. Let us stay on the ring and Anne. So Anne Boleyn not only was not giving Henry VIII a son, she was also enemies with Thomas Cromwell, one of the most powerful people at court. She was said to be basically too mouthy, too knowledgeable, too much, just too much. And so she finds herself with very few alliances at court, which was a major challenge for her. The court was full of vipers, and so she had to find something that would prevent her from being pushed out from Henry's adoration. And so she goes to her own family. So Anne Boleyn had two brothers, Thomas and George. And she turned to her family to hope that they would be able to help her, at least listen to her with her concerns. But this was sadly a misstep that Thomas Cromwell jumped on. He really wanted to find a way to get rid of Anne so that then the king could marry Jane Seymour. And so in 1536, Anne Boleyn was dragged before the court, and the accusations were shocking. They said that she had committed treason and committed adultery. And the person she committed adultery with was the person who likely owned this ring. The ring was probably owned by her brother, either George or Thomas, but George is the one who was accused of having an affair with her. George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, had definitely not had an affair with his sister. There is absolutely no documentation for it. But the charges were so shocking, the whole court was stunned. And Anne vociferously, vehemently denied it ever happening, as did George. And it is most likely a masterful conspiracy created by Thomas Cromwell in order to ensure that his lord, Henry VIII, could marry Jane Seymour. So this ring, though, we do know that it was owned by a Boleyn. If you notice, it has a bull on the front face. It's a large signet ring of the size and style that a man would have worn. But if we look at the bull was often used by the Boleyn family, bull for Boleyn, and they often put bulls on things. This gold ring would have definitely been something that would have been a prized possession of one of the men of the Boleyn family. And by looking at its era, the British Museum looked, and they certainly dated it to around the Tudor times of Henry VIII. And so therefore it was either Thomas or George who had it. But it could have been a ring that George was wearing at the time all this intrigue was happening, because it's from around that time period. So potentially this ring heard those lost secrets of Anne Boleyn when she talked to her brother. It might have been worn by George when he was accused of these crimes. What's interesting is that sadly, Anne Boleyn was found guilty, and then she was executed. She maintained her innocence until the very end, and no one was listening. She was executed with one swift stroke. What happened to the ring, though, is that it survived because it was found at the home of her cousin. Her cousin was living in Kent, and a detectorist in 2019 was wandering through the space and found it. And because it was something that was so valuable, he turned it in so that people could study it, and it is now at Hampton Court, sadly the place where her husband, Henry VIII, had many, many times where he interacted with her before she was married, where she would have visited when she was married, and then where Jane Seymour would have visited when she eventually married Henry VIII and had his son, Edward. So what happened to George? Well, on the 23rd of April, 1536, George had expected to receive the Order of the Garter, which is an honor from the king. But even though he thought he was getting it, it went at the last minute to Sir Nicholas Carew, which should have been a tell for George. The next day, they set up a special commission to look into treason. Anne had been arrested, as I said, but George was arrested on that same day, May 2nd, 1536. And then by May 12th, George was put on trial. And what's interesting is, while Anne was put on trial and she was found guilty of incest, many people didn't believe George. And there was a lot of people who wondered if he would be acquitted. Of course, he couldn't be acquitted if she had been found guilty. So he was found guilty, even though there was no evidence of it. And so he was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. And when he was executed, he, on the morning of May 17th, he stood up there and gave a very long speech. Now, it was customary for the people to be executed and not say that they were innocent, even if they felt they were. But he did say, beware, trust not in the vanity of the world or the flatteries of the court or the favor and treacheries of fortune. He went on to say, if he hadn't been so trusting, he would probably live. Of course, he was executed. And so we do not know if this ring was his, but it sure does remind us of the time before the Boleyns were not persona non grata at court. Thank you very much for watching Artlust. Watch again for another episode of Objects in History. Like, follow, share, comment. Tell everyone you know. Have a great day.